До нашої останньої сьогодні доповідачки, це є пані Колет Хартвіч, яка виступить з дуже цікавою такою також доповіддю. Митрополит Андрей Шептицький і міф українського антисемітизму. Пані Колет, прошу, запрошую вас до слова.
Yes. Слава Ісусу Христу. I'm sorry that I can't yet talk in Ukrainian. It will come. I'm talking as a standard diaspora person who's essentially preoccupied with the tactical aspect of dispelling this myth and many others about Sheptitsky. His whole life, Andrei Sheptitsky, both as a European, and he was a real European, and a Polish aristocrat, and above all as a Christian, spent dreaming of the unity of Eastern and Western Christian churches. That not only made his life heroic, and I hope they can, but it also makes... Yes. Okay. And also made his life controversial. The myth of anti-Semitism seems to follow the Archbishop's legacy. In Ukraine, he's considered rightly one of the founding fathers of contemporary Ukraine. Today, I'd like to, as a standard diaspora member and somebody of mixed Polish and Ukrainian ascendants, dismantle those unjustified accusations. I'm not a Sheptitsky scholar and I'm not a historian. Less than a decade ago, when I started learning the Ukrainian language with Kristina Vasilkiv, who's somebody to whom the Ukrainian language is very important, she suggested that we study exclusively the life of the Archbishop. By God's grace and through my social work in Ukraine, where I have the first social project financed by the Luxembourg government, which is a European historical first. And through my collaboration with the Ukrainian Catholic University, where I taught last year a project drafting course, I got to know His Eminence Boris Kodziak. A few years back, he requested that I translate a book by Bogdan Bochurkiv, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Soviet state, into French. And my special interest in Andrei Sheptitsky grew with the translation of this book. On the other hand, in the 70s, I was the person who created a very known international Jewish organization in Luxembourg, Hadassah, and that is quite an achievement for a non-Jew. I collaborated mostly with the great rabbi of Luxembourg, and therefore, like for Sheptitsky, Jewish culture is very close to my heart. Finally, one of my Ukrainian ancestors, Senator Ignatiy Platonovich Zakrevsky, played a large part in the Dreyfus affair at the turn of the 19th century. He was kicked out by the Tsar as a senator for blaming publicly both France and Russia for being anti-Semitic. I've defended many other causes, like the recognition of the Armenian genocide, and now we're fighting in Berlin for the recognition by the Bundestag of Holodomor as a genocide. It's a very important fight, and we need the help of Ukrainian historians. On the 29th of October 1933, memorial services for Holodomor victims were held in Western Ukraine, the first thanks to Andrei Sheptitsky's support. A people assembly was held condemning the starvation of Ukraine by the Soviet government. Saving themselves from the famine and seeking help, people fled over the Zbur and informed Ukrainians in Western Ukraine, particularly Galicia and Volhynia, about what was taking place in Soviet Ukraine. Galicia and Volhynia, mainly the Greek Catholic Church headed by the Metropolitan, became thus messengers of the world between Soviet Ukraine and the diaspora. The Western Ukrainian Bureau in Canada contacted the Metropolitan with a request to raise his voice to the world about what was happening in Soviet Ukraine. His reply was lightning quick. He issued a proclamation called Ukraine in Death Throes. It was translated into many languages and made a very important contribution to the dissemination of information. It resulted in the founding of the Civic Relief Committee for Starving Soviet Ukraine in 1933 in Galicia, collected funds in support of the starving. The fundamental point was the dissemination of truthful information. We all know that not only the Soviet government, but the New York Times, for instance, denied a genocide, and that Walter Duranty said that everything was fine. There's food, there's grain. We're even selling it. There are many fabrications of history and forging circulating today, especially about a false memory of events that happened over 50 years ago. And the Soviet Union has never been convicted of its crimes against humanity. It's legal and it's important. Germany had Nuremberg, but Russia had nothing. So Yad Vashem's refusal to proclaim Andrei Sheptitsky righteous among the nations is very damaging to both countries. To some extent, we don't know what documents and from what sources the Yad Vashem has received on that account. The damning side of Yad Vashem's critique of Sheptitsky's role is best articulated by its former director, Mr. Arads, who describes Sheptitsky as inconsistent and says that his early call to join the Germans were understood by many Ukrainians as a call to help the Germans' anti-Jewish policies. The practical result being pogroms, large-scale volunteering to the Ukrainian police, and the active participation in the mass murder of Jews. So Sheptitsky certainly did not intend for this to happen, but it did. This inconsistency was buttressed by the perception that the Metropolitan lacked personal risk, which is not true. According to this point of view, Sheptitsky himself was never at any personal risk, and finding himself in a position of unparalleled influence, could and should have done much more than he did, because the Germans wouldn't have dared to move against him personally. The truth is that while Sheptitsky faced no threat for himself, he had responsibilities to protect the priests and nuns under his charge, and that was his priority. Sheptitsky's brother Clementi was beatified by Pope John Paul II and recognized by Yad Vashem for carrying out his brother's vision. In addition to the testimonies of the Jews who survived due to the Metropolitan, there are also testimonies of Jews who say they're sure it was his conduct that contributed to Ukrainians joining the rank of the murderers. The chairman of the directorate of the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Institute Yad Vashem, Avner Shalev, wrote about this in an official letter responding to requests from Moshe Assman, January the 21st, 2020. According to him, the commission concluded that there is no doubt about Metropolitan Sheptitsky having rescued Jews during the Holocaust, but this is very complex. Quote, because of his having welcomed the German occupiers in 1941 and having encouraged Ukrainians to join the forces. The Yad Vashem Resource Center's short profile on Sheptitsky raises many questionable accusations. He's presented as one of the leaders of the Ukrainian nationalist movement and says that that movement became increasingly extremist and adopted a pro-German anti-Semitic ideology. Sheptitsky did not approve of the movement's terrorist activities, but he did not denounce them too often either. Despite his sympathy for the Jews, Sheptitsky did nothing to stop the Ukrainian nationalists from backing Germany. The idea of the ends justifying the means, widely adopted by Ukrainian nationalists and implemented by their supporters, the radical methods, this was, however, unacceptable to the Metropolitan. There were moments in the history of Lviv, specifically, when Sheptitsky openly condemned the instigators and the terrorists. because he said the right cause cannot be fought with unworthy methods. So he condemned the assassination of Count Potocki in 1908, the terror waged by the OUN at the end of the 1920s, and the period of World War II. Each and every time, Sheptitsky openly condemned the murders and terrorist activity in his sermons, of which possibly the best known is the "Thou shalt not kill" from November 42. I quote, "Those who delude themselves and others that political killing is not a sin, do so strangely, as if politics released somebody from obedience to God's laws and justified a crime that is abhorrent to human nature. This is not so. A Christian is required to observe God's law both in private and in political and social life. A person who sheds the innocent blood of an enemy, a political opponent, is as much a murderer as a person who does this in the course of a robbery and deserves the same punishment from God and excommunication from the church." That is the idea he promoted of the reserved sin. A Christian, and not just a Christian, but every person, is required by human nature to love his neighbor. Murder is a reserved sin in our eparchy. In a letter dated March 42, the Metropolitan imposed on murderers the punishment of ecclesiastic excommunication reserved for the ordinariate. Let them, Christians, make murderers understand by their behavior, their admonitions, avoidance of company with them, avoidance of family relations with them. They regard them as a pestilence and a danger to the village. If no one greets the criminal, allows him to come into a house, no one speaks to him, no family agrees to become related to him, when even in church Christians avoid him and people shun him on the wayside, when no one tells him anything or buys anything from him, then perhaps he will reform and begin a life of repentance. And if they have the right to absolve the reserved sin, they must keep in mind, the priest, that the penance for murder must be appropriate to the magnitude of the crime. If the crime has been committed several times and a sadistic liking for it begins to develop, if the crimes are publicly known, then one must impose not only severe penance, but also penance combined with the public making of amends with the Christian views of the people. This idea that Sheptitsky was one of the leaders of Ukrainian nationalist movement was carefully crafted by the Soviets after his death, because one must look at the motivation. After Sheptitsky's death, falsified allegations of support for Nazi causes were proactively used by the Soviet propaganda machine to discredit Sheptitsky, his work, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It later led to the ban of that church in the Soviet Ukraine and pushed the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church to move underground. It is common knowledge that Stalin was out to destroy the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. We know that, for example, after Sheptitsky's death, the position of head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was offered to his brother Clementi. After Clementi's refusal to go against his brother's wishes, he was imprisoned and later shot. We know that a lot of documents the Soviet provided to the West and Israel have been falsified. Please remember the case of John Demyanuk, a Ukrainian immigrant to the US. After an exchange of secret documents between the US and the Soviets, he was accused not only of collaboration, but of murder of hundreds of thousands and extradited to Israel for trial. In the end, the Supreme Court of Israel set him free based on not enough evidence. In fact, it was a case of falsification by the Soviets. The identity was falsified. A great article by Olga Bertelsen in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Ukrainian and Jewish emigres as targets of KGB active measures in the 70s, presents facts and operations of the KGB, which to an extent were unknown to most of us. Even if later in Germany, Demyanuk stood trial for being a guard in many of the concentration camps, He certainly was not the Ivan the Terrible that the KGB wanted to portray. In the excellent Michal Vavronek's text, Andrei Sheptitsky and Christian patriotism, that is a good concept, in light of Ukrainian nationalism, Vavronek presents a well-researched case on why Sheptitsky cannot be seen as a nationalist pro-German who did nothing to stop the atrocity committed by Ukrainian nationalists and Germans in the famous Lviv pogroms. Not only Vavronek argues against the idea of Sheptitsky being one of the leaders of that Ukrainian nationalist movement, but he also presents in extenso how persistently Sheptitsky tried to defend the autonomy of the church and religion from politics. Sheptitsky was a religious, not a political leader, and a Ukrainian patriot who believed that politics of all sorts has no place in the church. The perspective of Polish historians in general, not this one, tends to strongly support the myth of Sheptitsky as a man taking advantage of his position in order to become the leader of Ukrainian political and national life. A statesman, a national activist, always placed together with Petlura, Melnik, and Bandera. It may be true that Sheptitsky wanted an influence on the shape of the Ukrainian national structure, and why not? Yet he aimed to acquire this very influence through the important idea of Christian patriotism. In his view, Catholicism, that is religion, should be the fundament, the binding force, able to consolidate the church Catholicism, which is universal, transnational, and ultramountain in spirit. When writing in 1941 in a document titled How to Build a National Home, Sheptitsky concluded, from what has been said, it's clear how great the role of the church and the clergy is in the general order. The strength of the motherland, to a great extent, depends on the educational power of the church, on the continuous educational effort of the clergy directed towards youth, on the preaching of the gospel, and explicating the Christian moral principles. On that very work depend the civic virtues. So I am a citizen based on religion. This is also the definition of democracy. For Sheptitsky, education meant a great deal, and the role of the clergy was paramount. Thanks to his background, his various interests and diverse knowledge, enlightenment, and education were not empty words. In 1932 already, in his sermon to Ukrainian youth, Sheptitsky had warned the young about dangers of extremism and intolerance. In a pastoral letter, following the occupation of Galicia by Nazi Germany, Sheptitsky defined a new hope for independent modern Ukraine as so. From the new government, we expect wise and just leadership, taking into consideration the needs and welfare of all citizens inhabiting our land, without regard to their faith, nationality, or social status. That is almost Roman citizen conception that in his time was very progressive, and it certainly couldn't coexist with the ideas of Nazi Germany. He also asked his faithful the right questions about anti-Semitism and saved at least 150 Jews in Western Ukraine at a time when execution followed upon capture for such deeds. The Metropolitan also promised Rabbi Levin that the saved Jewish children would not be baptized. The Catholic Church had a rule that, of course, wasn't made public, that the Jewish children who had been saved and baptized were not to be returned either to the remaining family or to Jewish institution, and there was a big fight in France after the war about 2 Jewish boys. It took a year to return them to the remaining family in Israel. This did not exist for Sheptitsky. Although Sheptitsky did not sympathize with Nazi ideology, when the Germans occupied Western Ukraine, He initially believed that German rule would be better than Soviet rule, essentially because the communist atheistic system was, for a priest, of course, more diabolic than any other. In June 1941, as honorary head of the Ukrainian National Council in Lviv, he supported the creation of the Ukrainian state, appealed to German authorities to permit the establishment of a united Ukraine, including all of eastern Ukraine. This was perhaps not realistic, but many in the Ukrainian elite believed so. His optimism waned when he realized this would not be possible, and when he witnessed the cruelty of the Nazis towards the local population, and in particular the Jews. In early 1942, he sent a letter to Himmler protesting Nazi's treatment of the Jews and the use of Ukrainians in anti-Jewish repressions. He also began to provide refuge to Jews hiding from the Nazis and instructed monasteries and convents to do the same. After the Soviets occupied Western Ukraine in 1939 and 1944, Sheptitsky remained in Lviv in order to preserve the church. The Soviet attacks on the church were restrained until his death because of his great authority. His public funeral demonstrated a continuing respect for him, and his death greatly weakened the position of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. A determined objector to the anti-religious Soviet Union, Sheptitsky saw the Germans briefly as liberators from communism. That is said by Timothy Snyder when he defended in 2009 Sheptitsky. It was also the view of the American intelligence, by the way. He wanted a Ukrainian army because he thought an army was essential for the creation of the state, and he thought that that experience of being auxiliaries to the German army was essential to create one. Yad Vashem has rejected at least a dozen requests to recognize Sheptitsky since the 60s, even though many other people who were, in fact, also Nazi activists and loyalists, as Oskar Schindler, have been honored. However, the Anti-Defamation League honored Sheptitsky with the Jan Karski Courage to Care Award in 2013. You have to realize that Galicia was one of the few crown jewels of the Habsburg Empire and had been a thriving multicultural capital until the end of the empire. Many of the Ukrainian elite members had that nostalgia of the happy Habsburg time, which they saw as a fruit of German culture. The Sheptitsky brothers knew both the culture of the Habsburgian and Prussian Empire, and Andrei has studied in Breslau. His tenure as archbishop spanned 2 world wars and 7 political regimes: Austrian, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Soviet, Nazi Germany, and Soviet again. Both the Polish and the Soviet regimes were not easy on his church or on the Lviv population, particularly the Jews. During the Polish-Ukrainian War in 1918, a pogrom was perpetrated by Polish soldiers and civilians against the local Jews. And the Soviets, after marching on Lviv, started sending people to the gulags in hundreds of thousands. The simple word of Holodomor could get you a one-way ticket to Siberia. Sheptitsky was a fighter for his faith and the Christian values. Finally, it is of no surprise that Sheptitsky, as most of Eastern Europe, welcomed Nazi Germany as a liberator. The ardent fight for the national cause seemed to come to an end with the coming of Nazi Germany. In fact, it was only a dream, badly shattered. Following the invasion of Ukraine, subjugation of Lviv, and June 1941, the OUN declared an independent Ukrainian state. And Sheptitsky had already issued his pastoral letter welcoming the victorious German army as the liberator from the enemy and recognizing Stetsko as the de facto head of the new Ukrainian government. That letter, written in the hope that Germans would free Ukraine, is one of the main documents used against him. Still, he came to regret his support almost immediately. The consensus was, scholarly consensus, that he was persuaded into supporting it during a June meeting with Štetsko, during which the crucial information of the fracture within the UN in two schools, as well as the fact that the administration would be under the control of Bandera, was omitted. The belated conclusion that the Nazi horrors were far worse than anything done by the Soviets took Šepticki almost a full year to realize. The accusation of some historians is that in the first phase of the war, Šepticki was unable to develop an adequate response to the Nazi aggression. Once he understood, Šepticki did a great deal. In a series of pastoral letters disseminated until his death in 1944, he inveighed consistently against political murder. He should call for community-wide shunning of murderers with the disgust and disgrace they deserve. The newly unsealed Vatican archives shone a new light on Pope Pius XII's knowledge of the Holocaust. Now historians say they have found evidence that suggested that Pius learned of the mass slaughter of Jews in Lviv in the fall of 1942, and largely through Šepticki himself, who informed the Pope of those mass killings. They found a memo from a Vatican staffer that warned against believing the reports from Šepticki, dismissing these accounts on the grounds that Jews easily exaggerate and Orientals, what a nice reference to Šepticki, are really not an example of honesty. So there is some racism. University of Munster researchers discovered that Šepticki wrote a letter that spoke of 200,000 Jews massacred in Ukraine under the outright diabolical German occupation. So not only the Soviets were diabolical, it's true, but the German. Pope, though Germany was in principle a Christian country, in principle, Pope Pius XII is not well regarded by the Jews. Although he hid some Jews in churches during the Holocaust, a large body, as we've discussed, of historical evidence points to the fact that he in fact helped Hitler to power and trivialized the Holocaust, despite having reliable knowledge of its true extent. Whereas in Šepticki's case, Jewish culture was part of Šepticki's cultural background. At the age of 20, he started studying Hebrew, and by the time he was archbishop, he spoke it fluently. Jewish culture and languages were also one of the cultural interests he had shared with his friend Cardinal Tisserand. He made regular canonical visits to the Jewish elders on Lviv, and he donated to their charities. Accusations of Judaizing his church were frequent, coming from his clergy and at that time. And he usually replied, "I consider it my duty to convey to them the Lord's revelations in their own language." The intense lobbying of Yad Vashem on behalf of Šepticki is led by the impassioned but dwindling group of survivors that he personally hid. They include former Polish Foreign Minister Adam Daniel Rothfeld, Nobel Prize-winning chemist Roald Hoffmann, who was hid in my favorite town, Zoloshiv, David Kahan, the former chief rabbi of the Israeli Air Force. The mounting chorus of voices calling for Yad Vashem's reappraisal of Šepticki also includes his former director, Avner Shalev, who recently declared that Yad Vashem needs to rethink its position. What we know was that Šepticki was informed of the Lviv pogrom of 1941 by the chief Lviv rabbi, Ezekiel Levin. The two enjoyed cordial relations, and the rabbi had traveled to the metropolitan residence with the tragic tidings. The specifics of the meeting remain a mystery because of two different accounts given decades apart by the rabbi's son, Kurt Levin, who would be saved by Šepticki and become one of his fiercest advocates. What Šepticki had pledged to do exactly for the Jews of Lviv during that meeting is still debated. that the cleric offered sanctuary to the rabbi and his family is not disputed. The rabbi accepts it for his own children, but refused help for himself because he felt he had to remain with his community. Sheptitsky took in 2 of Levin's boys, providing false baptismal certificates, false identities, and instruction to his priest to train the boys to pray in Ukrainian. Not one Jewish child saved by Sheptitsky was lost to the Nazi or to the Jewish people. While spending several years in monasteries, none was converted to Christianity. One girl became a nun out of her own volition. Sheptitsky reiterated the point to high-ranking Nazis that they couldn't kill the Jews, who made official visits to his residence. He also wrote personally to Hitler and Himmler, urging clemency for the Jews of Galicia. Let's not forget that his letters to Pope Pius XII mention that the Nazi regime was diabolical by nature. Not being able to speak openly about the Jews in his speech or his leaflets, much of his moral message had to be coded. And this is also a reproach that was made to him about that roundabout and indirect phrasing. The lack of direct references to Jews. But he couldn't take risk, and he couldn't make his priest take risks while distributing the leaflets. The final argument against Sheptitsky is his creation or contribution to the creation of the Galician Waffen-SS division in the spring of 1943. It was first a precaution against a mass anarchy that could inevitably break out with the end of the war, and he knew that Germany would lose soon enough, and that the Ukrainian nationalists wanted to seize the moment to create the nucleus of an army, which he thought was a good idea. And I repeat that the American intelligence also thought that that would happen. The Galician SS division would be an Ukrainian instrument defending Ukrainian national interests, with the proviso they would not be used against the Allies and would be used solely against the advancing Soviets. Sheptitsky, whether directly or indirectly, we don't know, blessed the division and the young men who joined it, but retained no relationship with it. He certainly could not have known that some blood-stained members of the Ukrainian auxiliary police would join it after the severe losses during the Battle of Brody. The unit's composition and career, the particularities of the fighting record of the Galician Waffen-SS division remains a deeply contentious issue which has been discussed both at Nuremberg and later by a Canadian commission. Ukrainian anti-Semitism, both yesterday and today, and that's my main point, is a myth. Many projects happening all around Ukraine is all the evidence we need today. The Jewish Confederation of Ukraine's Righteous Amongst the Nations project seeks to present, and it's very important, in all 2,000 and almost 700 Ukrainian writers, Gentiles, in one book, underlining the importance to know more about these heroes, especially because they were not Jewish. It's important for both Ukrainians and Jews to know and promote these heroes who were against xenophobia and hatred. Another project by Maria Rauscher Osborne asks important questions about Jewish burial sites. One of them is, who can and will care for them in what ways? Rauscher Osborne and her team, made up essentially of non-Jewish Ukrainians, I insist, is attempting to create a program of care to stimulate ideas and critical consideration to restore the long-forgotten Jewish burial sites all around Ukraine, because it's important for the memory of both people. The Metropolitan continues to be at the center of debates around themes such as nationality, national idea, role in the conflicting relationship between the peoples of the region, attitude during World War II, and anti-Semitism. From Polish historians, Adam Kubasik considers that Szeptycki used his pastoral ministry to establish himself as a political leader, and Mr. Wikzarski believes that his political activism of Szeptycki led to chauvinist nationalism, which contributed to tensions between the two people. Conversely, Andrzej Ziba emphasized that the Polish elites, particularly in the Polish Catholic, the Roman Catholic Church, always ostracize the Metropolitan and asserts that wrongs are shared. Many choices that the Metropolitan had to make in his lifetime were in fact choices between two evils. Yet he managed to maintain his Christian ideals and teachings. We should not tire of demanding Yad Vashem's reconsideration of Szeptycki's good deeds, following the example of the chief rabbi of Ukraine. It would help both Ukrainians and Jewish people to find a mutual understanding and promote the image of Szeptycki in terms of honesty and courage. One of his main merits is to have encouraged the virtue of saborness, a beautiful concept of spiritual unity. Whatever the historical and cultural differences inside and outside of Ukraine and its diaspora, spiritual unity is essential to Ukraine's survival, especially today in a war unlike any other, not only military, but also an information and linguistic war. Spiritual unity, as recalled by the scriptures, should be like a seamless tunic. We are blessed with a second prophet of Sabornos that I'm blessed to have known, His Eminence Boris Kudziak. And the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church still has the mission to bring together East and West. Be proud of it. I'd like to leave you with the words of Андрея Шептицький to the Ukrainian people during the National Assembly in 1933 and at the beginning of the First World War in 1914 and during also the Second War, which he always repeated. Ukrainian people, wherever you may be, oppose communism, atheism, and unite. Thank you.
Дуже вам дякуємо, пані Колет, за таку довгу і цікаву доповідь. Пані Магдалена Новак, ви, здається, маєте запитання до пані Колет.
But in English, please.
Yes, I will speak English. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for this interesting speech. And this was, you underlined the facts that we've already all discussed today, that it is important to find support for what is said, and that there are a lot of myths all around, even in historical work. However, I would like to underline that perhaps I would like to straight out something that you said about the Polish historians.
Which one?
Yes, I just am now sending to everybody. There is a text my text written 3 years ago about the Polish historians and their writing in the second half, of course, of the 20th century, from 1945 till today. And what they wrote about Szeptycki, who wrote and in what aspect. And what is very important to underline, that the text is not only about historians, but there are many people who are different specialities. We have, and the word Polish might be really misleading, because I just included people like Stanisław Stępień, who I know he wanted to be included, because I just took it that everybody who published in Polish, not to exclude anybody, yes? And if you look at that, it's not so bad. Because generally there was a great interest in Szeptycki, starting from Edward Prus, who was the worst, who wrote really very negatively. And his work was exactly what Father Dacko said, to stop the idea, the Giedroyć idea of cooperation between former Soviet nations of restoring the nations. He started in the 80s. When the Soviets knew that the system is going to collapse, it was getting towards it. And just to put some kind of to increase the conflict between Polish, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Belarusians. We know that he was probably an agent. Most of us, we as historians, Polish historians, excluded him from the discourse. He is not quoted by historians. And other historians who wrote, many of them are active. They wrote with some academic notes. They usually wrote, honestly. Sometimes they didn't know anything. We have Ryszard Torzecki, who was very positive. Rzecz Motyka, who really, in his books, he included a chapter on Szeptycki during the World War, and he tried, of course, having what he had at that time when he was writing. Stanisław Stępień, who is, as I know, Ukrainian by origin, but he does what he can, and he also helped other historians to publish. Bogdan Zakrzewski, who was the historian of literature, and he published the letters, Fredzo's letters. And Moscow is Ukrainian by origin, but he published in Polish, and he's, as far as now as I know, theologist, not historian. But Zakrzewski Polonist, Torzecki historian, Motyka historian, Wołczański historian, but he mostly published only documents, no comments. Ziemba, when he wrote in the 90s, wrote really very properly. When he published later in the newspapers, that's a different story. Here from Gdańsk, from my own institution, we have Opatki, Koko, and me, 3 people, and Stegner. So many historians who wrote about Szeptycki. Of course, it was in the 90s. Now I continue, they stopped. We have Papieżyńska, Turek. So we have a lot of people who wrote sometimes about Szeptycki, but we have only a few who constantly, who stick to the topic. And that's the problem, that we don't have a lot of historians who deal with the problem. And that's why you have such a, when you read Prus, you find Prus, and if somebody doesn't know that he's an agent, he was an agent, he's dead. So he would go, and he's quoting letter. The book that Liliana pointed out 2 days ago. That is really a fake. A poem. Yeah, no, not a poem. A fiction. But he's quoting it. A fiction. Yes. Is quoting it. So just you can go to this text and you can quote it. It's open access and it analyzes all. And we can see that the problem is that nobody writes about Szeptycki. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. And if somebody writes, this is just a journalist. Sometimes Motyka, yes, Motyka usually writes people get interested in 1940s, Liliana's work. So Motyka really appears as a kind of person who tries to balance. He is specialist in this period, yes? So it's not so bad as you said. However, generally, atmosphere is not good. Perfect, I would say, yes? Thank you very much for your text. I think the Jewish problem is really definitely one of the most important. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'd like just a small comment. Thank you very much, Madam Hартвіч, for your paper. It's very interesting, very exciting. So it's because the topic, antisemitism, Yad Vashem, to put a small comment, the Yad Vashem issue. Only chief rabbi can and had right to initiate the process, to initiate the case. And so the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Asman, is actually doing a lot. He is doing a great job. And he's very supportive to the case of Sheptitsky, and only we can hope and count. And still, I think that maybe if like our common efforts, we could make something with this case of Metropolitan Sheptitsky at Yad Vashem. But again, it's very complicated and it's very difficult. And I like your paper, but it's also a lot of generalization in your paper. And I think that we must approach very delicately to such important issues. And again, the Metropolitan and Division Galicia, Metropolitan and Ukrainian police, there still are new documents which are open like recently. And we must understand that there are some documents that are changing currently. And I mentioned recently about this plea of priests to join the division as chaplains. They didn't ask Sheptitsky to be a chaplain in the division. So there there are some documents we are changing our view. And we can't base our, we can base our knowledge only on some memories, for example, of Kubiyovich. And again, Sheptitsky and militia. In September 1941, Metropolitan asked parish priests to persuade young people not to enter Ukrainian militia. So it's very important. It's unknown. It's not quoted. And again, the documents which were used at Yad Vashem during during the 80s and 90s, still those documents, they didn't include, for example, the documents from the Vatican archives or the documents really opened in Ukrainian archives. So the case is in progress, and I mean we still have hope that maybe in future the case of Metropolitan Sheptitsky will be re-evaluated, and hopefully he will get this name righteous among the nation. I hope, and I think it's quite possible. So we'll see. But again, we need not to put together the case of Sheptitsky and his activity with the Demjanjuk case. So it's a very different historical issues. It's a very different cases, and I don't recommend. And really, I think we still avoid to do such comparisons. So I'm sorry. Maybe I was maybe I sound too critical, but I didn't want to in any sense to criticize you. I really, it's a great paper, but the history is a science, and we need to balance our views and our facts and to avoid some comparisons. So thank you very much.
Дорогі мої, дуже вам дякую за сьогоднішню дискусію. Дуже дякуємо пані Колет, що вона виголосила таку цікаву доповідь, велику доповідь. Дуже вам всім дякую за ваші коментарі. Я думаю, що в нас сьогодні була дуже гаряча конференція, так? Ми дуже сьогодні дискутували багато. Що є важливим за сьогоднішній день? Ми зрозуміли, що основне наше завдання – це є потреба співпраці, потреба в тому, щоб ми якось рухались всі по одній лінії, можливо, зробили якусь дослідницьку програму. Ми потребуємо опіки церкви нашої, щоб нас зорганізувала, тому що перед нами є фінансові, матеріальні виклики. В всякому разі, ми сьогодні започаткували щось дуже нове. Новий виклик, який ми озвучили в цьому ефірі. І я думаю, що він мусить достукатися до відповідних людей. Дякую вам за сьогоднішню роботу. Завтра в нас є 4-й день, останній день. Запрошую брати участь у обговоренні спадщини митрополита Андрея Шептицького. Всім дуже вам дякую. До побачення.